Hello, and thank you again for joining us for another installment of Dragonfire Designs. And today we're going to be casting up a resin copy of Oola's slave collar from Return of the Jedi. So let's go ahead and take a look at that process. Now before we begin, let's take a look at the silicone mold that I'll be using for this project. In order to get this, what I did was I got measurements from my original client who commissioned me to make the Oola slave collar. Took the measurements for her neck, and I used a non-sulfur oil-based clay that I was able to roll out and sculpt all of the detail for the collar, and I did it in a flat because what we're going to be doing here when we cast it is we're going to pull it while it's still hot and shape it around a form. So again, I used oil-based clay to make my original sculpt, put mold walls up around that, poured silicone over that, let that set up, and that's how I ended up with my mold, which is an open back silicone mold. And we'll move on to doing the actual casting next. Now as you can see here, I've got the silicone mold laid out, and I've already gone ahead and sprayed it with a coating of the MR150 mold release. And that's going to help the resin piece come out a lot cleaner and easier, and it also helps preserve our mold. So we've gone ahead and done that, and we're going to move on to mixing our resin. Now I've got equal parts A and B. Go ahead and pour those into our mixing cup. And we're going to thoroughly mix. And you'll notice I am using a wooden shish kebab skewer here. The reason I'm using this to mix my resin today is because in my mold I have some very fine line detail areas that I want to make sure I can get all of the resin into, and I'm going to use the tip to get any air bubbles out. First, we're going to make sure we're well mixed here. Now that we've got our resin mixed, I'm going to go ahead and pour. And this type of silicone mold is often referred to as an open back silicone mold for fairly obvious reasons, because the back is open. Okay. Almost got this filled here. I'm taking care to pour it nice and slowly to avoid air bubbles, and we just want to make sure that we don't spill any of the resin, so that's not fun to clean up. Okay, now that I've got it completely filled, I'm just running the tip of the skewer through the fine detail areas, and that helps release any air bubbles that might be trapped. I'm just going to go ahead and put a little bit more resin. I want to make sure this is filled all the way up to the topmost edge. There we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and let that set up, and once it's just about cured, I'm going to pull it a little early, and we're going to wrap it around a form to get a nice collar shape. Okay, now that the resin has started to set up, but you can see it's still nice and movable, we're going to get ready to pull this out. And in order to form it into the collar, we're just going to use a piece of Tupperware container. And I've gone ahead and already sprayed that down with some mold release. I've got some tape ready to help me hold it in place. And so now, since we're going to pull this a little early, I'm going to gently get it out of the mold. I don't want to stretch or distort the piece, as it is still soft and pliable. But this is what's going to allow us to work with it and get our collar shape. Now if we had let this set up completely, we would have a straight bar, which would be pretty unusable for a collar. As you can see, I'm able to remove it easily. And we're going to go ahead and put it around this form. And because Oola's collar has the ends bent up, we're just going to shape that. I've got a few minutes to work with this before it completely sets up, and I try to make sure that I've got this on here nice and straight. I don't want it to be too wavy, because the whole point is that it should look very nicely crafted. So I'm going to go ahead and get that situated on there, and we're going to let the resin set up into shape, and we'll come back in a moment and see how it's done. Okay, now the resin, after about a good 15 minutes, it's finally cured to a state where we can go ahead and remove it. It's still somewhat pliable, so I'm not going to mess with it too much. But the next thing I'm going to want to do here is I'm going to take a blade and I'm going to cut along my back seam that I've got here to install our brass hinge. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and we'll come right back. So I've used a razor saw to go ahead and cut and separate two sections of the collar that are going to be hinged. Be putting in a brass hinge into the back. Got the little screws for it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay that out and mark it off to where I have to drill, because I am going to go ahead and put the screws in to help secure that so everything holds nicely. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and we will move on. Okay, now I've gone ahead and drilled those out so that we can put our brass hinge in. It's going to sit there just like that. And we'll put our screws in. When we get that all set into place, we're going to have a hinged collar. So I'm going to go ahead and do that step real quick, and we'll come right back. Now, you can see we have our brass hinge installed. So the collar opens nice and easily. What I'm going to do next is I'm going to go ahead and I'm lightly going to sand all of my edges where it's going to come in contact with the wearer's neck. So we want that side to be nice and smooth, soft and comfortable, obviously if it's going to go on a woman's neck. So I'll take that down, get it nice and cleaned up, and then we're going to get this ready to paint. Okay, I've given this a base coat of gray primer and then shot it in silver. And what we're going to do next is we have to go and add a little bit of brass accent to the inner line detail that we've got going here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and then we'll take a look at how that looks, and we'll move on to putting in the elastic hinge. And here we go with the finished piece. We've hand painted in the brass accents and then added in a piece of elastic. It's just glued across the back, and that stretches. Very simple mechanism for keeping that closed around the person's neck. And there you go. One resin cast Oola slave collar. Thank you for watching.